Education for Justice sponsored talk. Tonight, Professor Gerald Beyer will be speaking on access to higher education, Catholic teaching, and social justice. Dr. Beyer received his BA from Georgetown, has a master's from the Yale Divinity School, and his Ph.D. from Boston College in 2005. So he's well versed in Jesuit higher education and tradition. He's also a grad of St. Joe's Prep for the people here. He has numerous publications, including his book on recovering solidarity, lessons from Poland's unfinished revolution. He also teaches on Catholic social teaching and tradition, the nature of solidarity, human rights, economic justice, religion, and politics. All these research interests qualify him well to speak on tonight's topic. I'd like to have you join me in welcoming Professor Gerald Beyer.
Thanks, Steve. Welcome and thank you for coming. I want to express my gratitude to the University of Scranton for hosting me, in particular to Dave Zurek, as he corrected me earlier today. I lived in Poland for 5 years and learned Polish, so I said, oh, your name is Jurec? And he said, no, it's Zurek. So Dave Zurek, and also Mike Allison, who originally invited me to come here, both of various departments at the university and the Educating for Justice program. So I've been working on this issue of access to higher education for economically disadvantaged students for several years now, and I've published a number of articles on the topic. And so I'm sort of summarizing some of the research and the arguments that I've made in print. If you're interested in seeing the fuller argument, you could find those articles in the Journal of Catholic Social Thought and the magazine U.S. Catholic for a shorter version. I'm not going to read my entire paper, although I do have a lot of data to present and arguments to make because it's very lengthy. So I'm going to summarize my arguments and findings in order to hopefully provoke some discussion afterwards about the issue. I want to say at the outset that I'm not here to pass judgment on any one or any particular institution, but I do present data that casts certain institutions in a negative light. I also recognize, however, that the conclusions to be drawn from the data are debatable and the causal factors behind the situation are complex. Nonetheless, I merely wish to stimulate further conversation about this issue. And we had a very lively conversation, as a matter of fact, over dinner. And we were talking about the fact that, at least I believe that at a Jesuit institution, this is a vital conversation. It's a conversation that all Jesuit universities, by virtue of their mission and identity, must be having. And I hope that many of the Jesuit schools are having this conversation on their campuses. Before I dive into the arguments in my paper, I want to start with a story. Grew up in Dagoretti, which is a slum in Nairobi, Kenya. As a child, he went to bed hungry in a home with no running water. A bright, intellectually curious child, he attended one of Nairobi's best high schools until he was forced to drop out to support himself. At this point, he became a chokora, which is a homeless scavenger in his native Swahili. Life for Michael on the streets was unimaginable. He was forced by a gang to deal drugs. He escaped multiple brushes with death, while some of his friends were not so fortunate. Not knowing if he would survive, his fortune took a dramatic turn. A missionary from the United States told him that God wanted her to provide him with the financial assistance to complete high school. At that point, he decided to devote his life to helping children like himself in Dagoretti, and he established a boarding school called Dagoretti for Kids. While he also, a graduate of St. Joseph's University, was volunteering in Nairobi and put Michael in contact with Jesuits there. They recommended Michael for admission to St. Joseph's University. That summer, he was accepted with a full scholarship. I would suggest that Michael's story, the efforts of the St. Joseph's alumnus, and the university's actions serve as wonderful embodiments of the ideals of Catholic social teaching, which obligate all people to stand in solidarity with the poor and affirms the right to education for all. Unfortunately, stories like Michael's are all too rare on the campuses of our nation's Catholic colleges and universities. The vast majority of the students at all too many of these schools, including St. Joseph's, come from affluent backgrounds. While most of the nation's and the world's poor remain excluded from the halls of our institutions. Catholic social teaching does not permit us to be satisfied with allowing just a few exceptional people like Michael into our midst. So my paper has, there's a twofold question to my paper. There are two aspects of the paper, the normative aspect and the descriptive aspect. And I argue on the normative level that Catholic social teaching has long championed the right to education of all people, including the poor. Most often, it is explicitly referred to the right to primary and secondary education. So the question becomes, does the application of the right to education, which Catholic social teaching affirms unambiguously, include access to higher education, particularly for the economically disadvantaged? The second aspect of the paper relates to the descriptive level. And here I'm asking the question, are Roman Catholic colleges and universities in the United States doing all that they can to recruit, admit, and retain students from economically disadvantaged backgrounds? In other words, have they exercised solidarity with the marginalized and the preferential option for the poor, which are two of the key principles of Catholic social teaching, in their efforts to recruit, admit, and retain students from economically disadvantaged backgrounds? Now, I must say that this paper in my research thus far is an initial attempt to answer these questions. So it uses information pertaining to a number of Catholic universities and colleges, but it certainly doesn't look at all 228 and then some Catholic colleges and universities. But it brings to the fore certain empirical and demographic realities that pertain to many of the Catholic colleges and universities in the United States. And so I hope to stimulate further conversation about this and efforts to look at all Catholic colleges and universities across the country. So the argument that I advance can be summarized as follows. Catholic social teaching's emphasis on the right to education must include access to higher education, especially for the economically marginalized, in the United States knowledge-based society. In reality, many Catholic institutions of higher learning do not seem to be doing all that they can to grant access to economically disadvantaged students. However, Catholic social teaching on the right to education, solidarity, and the option for the poor requires that they do so. In general, many Catholic schools do not fare better than their secular counterparts in recruiting, admitting, and retaining economically disadvantaged students. In fact, some excellent and highly selective secular schools do a better job of this than Catholic institutions. So, this is the way my paper proceeds. First, I'll give an overview of the situation in the United States, of some empirical trends with regard to access to higher education. Then I'll look briefly at the right to education in international human rights agreements and Catholic social thought. Then I'll turn to the empirical situation, empirical data pertaining to the socioeconomic background of students at selected Catholic colleges and universities. And then finally, I'll draw some normative conclusions about the realization of the right to education at Roman Catholic colleges and universities and point to some future directions for growth in this regard. So first, just a brief look at the situation in the United States today. And so I'll use primarily the slides to speak about this. In 2006, the Chronicle of Higher Education had a series called The Growing Divide, which looked at this very issue of access and economic diversity. And it stated, their conclusions were as follows, that the divide between the haves and the have-nots was growing at the time. And when they say the haves and the have-nots, they're referring to both institutions, so the divide between institutions that have large endowments and those that don't was growing in terms of the quality of education and the amount of resources dedicated to each student, and also the gap between individual students on particular campuses. At that point, only 3% of the student bodies at the top 146 American colleges came from the bottom income quartile, whereas about 75% came from the top income quartile. So you can see, very simply, the fact that most of the students at these select colleges come from affluent backgrounds. This is striking, I believe. You're 25 times more likely to meet a wealthy student than an economically disadvantaged one on one of these campuses. Only 14% of the students at the 59 wealthiest private schools are Pell eligible. Now let me say a little bit about that term. It's imperfect because it's an imperfect way of measuring the presence of economically disadvantaged students on our campuses. For example, it doesn't catch students who are slightly above the threshold, who also may come from economically disadvantaged backgrounds. The threshold is about, the last time I checked, about $40,000 in terms of family income. In order to be Pell eligible, your family has to earn below that amount. Nonetheless, it's still regarded by most people looking at this issue as the best way to measure the prevalence of economically disadvantaged students on our campuses. Incidentally, I'll note that the U.S. News and World Report uses the Pell Grant indicator to talk about, to measure economic diversity on our campuses. I'll say more about that report in a little bit. So, only 14% of the students are Pell eligible at the 59 wealthiest private schools. Unfortunately, there's been a growing trend at public institutions, public universities as well, to admit and retain economically disadvantaged students. So 44 out of the 50 flagship public universities have less low-income students than in 1992. 22% of students at these schools receive Pell Grants, whereas nationally, 35% of children under 18 come from families who are Pell eligible. So you can see the disparity there. There's been a trend, unfortunately, in the financial aid world in which financial aid has been used to target highly qualified students, not the neediest of students. In other words, financial aid has become less and less need-based and moved towards what's called the merit-based category. That's what many of the reports that I've read concluded. And so I then looked at a report that came out more recently, and sort of an update to the Chronicle's Growing Divide. And the author stated he wanted to see if the divide had changed in that amount of time, in those several years. And his answer was, it's getting worse. So since 2006, it's actually gotten worse rather than better. And so he mentions that, again, the amount of graduates from the top quartile of family income was 82% in 2009-10, where it was 77% in 2004-5, whereas the bottom quartile was 8% in 2009-10, down from 10%. So you can see, again, the growing trend towards more students from economically affluent backgrounds as opposed to economically disadvantaged backgrounds. Okay. Now, in some of the research that I've done more recently, there are some small signs of progress, at least as I see it. The Pell Grant program under the Obama administration was greatly expanded, and the eligibility net, if you will, was cast more widely, and also the amount of the award was increased. And so it increased from about the Pell Grant, the overall funding of the Pell Grant increased from about $19 billion in 2009 to $36 billion. And so the amount of recipients went from about 10 million, went up to 10 million from 6 million in 2008 and 9. So again, you see there is an effort to expand the Pell Grant. And when I show the data, I think you'll see that there has been a salutary effect from this effort. In addition, some colleges, such as Williams College, moved to no loan policies and at the same time more aggressive recruiting of low-income students. It's not enough, the research has shown, it's not enough to provide more generous financial aid. you also have to ramp up efforts to recruit students who are talented, yet of lesser economic means. And some universities like Williams, Amherst College as well, have done a very good job at this. But there's been a backlash. And what I've seen in various places in the last couple of years, particularly since the financial crisis, 2008, 2009, a backlash against providing aid, subsidizing students who are of lesser economic means with the tuition dollars of students who are paying full tuition. And so this is a real point of contention on a lot of our campuses today, and something that needs to be addressed. I'm suggesting in my paper that when we have this conversation, we have to think about it within the framework of Catholic social teaching, the values of solidarity, the option for the poor, and the right to education. Okay? So just to give some examples, you can see this is 2007, 2008. You have UVA with 8%. These are the schools that I think were doing very poorly in terms of recruiting, admitting, and retaining economically disadvantaged students. UPenn with roughly the same, University of Delaware, Yale 9%, Princeton 10%. And I've looked for the most recent data that I could find, and you can see there is a positive trend. So UVA is up to 12%, Princeton 12%, Yale, Penn made a significant jump from 8 to 15% in those years. So it's not as though, from what I can see, in the last couple of years, people have become more intentional about this. Part of the progress is due to the expansion of the Pell Grant, but I also think some colleges are more aggressively recruiting, admitting, and retaining economically disadvantaged students. So then there are schools that were already doing better than those previous schools. You have some examples here. You could just take a look at them for yourself. And again, I want to note the progress that some of these schools have made, moving up to 16%, 17%, 21%, Grinnell College in recent years. And then it's important to note that there are schools that are excellent universities that have been and continue to do a very good job at recruiting, admitting, and retaining economically disadvantaged students. Why do I say that? Because one often hears the argument that if you are an excellent university that has rigorous admission standards and you have a very demanding curriculum, students won't be able to survive and thrive at universities like this if they come from economically disadvantaged backgrounds. But there are excellent universities like University of California, Berkeley, where you have 28% of the students who are Pell eligible. Okay? And you'll Amherst College, the president of Amherst College several years ago made a really strong push to change the culture on the campus and to admit more economically disadvantaged students. So you can see they made progress in those years. Berkeley hovered at about the same. And then there are schools that have many economically disadvantaged students among their ranks. You can see University of California, Riverside, a place like Berea College, 79% of the students there are Pell eligible. Tennessee State, 57%. So all I'm trying to do is set up a contrast here and show you that there are different types of institutions, and there are institutions that are doing well at recruiting, admitting, and retaining economically disadvantaged students. There are institutions that are not doing well, and then there are some in between. Okay? And again, you can see the progress, I think mostly due to the expansion of the Pell Grant program, but again also to give credit to some of the efforts that have been undertaken in recent years on some of these campuses. So, again, that was just to give you a quick snapshot of the empirical situation. I'm sure a lot more could be said. We could, maybe quibble about some of the data, but I wanted to at least give you that snapshot of the situation in the United States. I now want to talk about the right to education. And before I talk about Catholic social teaching, I want to discuss it briefly as it appears in some international agreements. Because what you find in these international agreements is a much greater specificity in delineating what constitutes a right to education. In other words, these documents specify what it means really to say all people have a right to education. So I'll just talk about this briefly. First, in the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, we have mentioned that everyone has the right to education. However, no reference to higher education is made, so one is left wondering, are they talking about higher education as well or not? But as we move forward, these treaties and covenants begin to include greater specificity and to talk about higher education. So the 1966 International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights mentions that higher education must be equally accessible to all and progressively become free. It also stipulates, among other things, that governments need to create frameworks to be able to make this happen, to realize this goal. In 1998, UNESCO published a document called the Framework for Priority Action for Change and Development of Higher Education. That's a mouthful, but I think you understand at least the point of the document. And in this document, the authors argue that the UN Universal Declaration itself mandated that governments must establish the necessary, quote, legislative, political, and financial frameworks, end quote, to ensure that, quote, equal access on the basis of merit to higher education becomes a reality. In other words, you have this body, UNESCO, looking back on the UN Universal Declaration and saying it's already there. It's already there, this, positing the right to higher education, or that higher education is included in the right to education, okay? That same document also says that, quote, no one can be excluded from higher education or its study fields, degree levels, and types of institutions on the grounds of race, gender, language, religion, age, or because of any economic or social distinctions or physical disabilities. Okay? So, as I said, you find a lot, progressively, more and more specification about what the right to education entails and how it should be realized. What are the necessary frameworks, legislative, political, economic, that need to be implemented in order to realize the right to education for all, which includes higher education. Now, Catholic social teaching, which is my area, my main area of research, does not have this much specificity. It does not develop the right to education on the tertiary level with as much clarity and detail. But it lists among the rights it sees as necessary for the protection of the dignity of the human person, the right to education. So I'm going to give a very brief introduction to the right to education in Catholic social teaching, and then I aim in my work to develop that in a certain direction, as you'll see. So as early as 1943, Pope Pius XI referred to the right to education in his Christmas radio message. Pope John XXIII emphasized this right probably more lucidly than any other pope before him and since. In his landmark encyclical in 1963, Pacem in Terris, which we're celebrating its 50th anniversary this year, he mentions the right to education. It's worth quoting the entire passage because I think it's really the most lucid place in all of Catholic teaching where we find this mention of higher education as part of the right to education. Quote, the natural law also gives man the right to share in the benefits of culture and therefore a right to a basic education and to technical and professional training in keeping with the stage of the educational development of the country to which he, and we would add, of course, she, belongs. Every effort should be made to ensure that persons be enabled, on the basis of merit, to go on to higher studies, so that, as far as possible, they may occupy posts and take on responsibilities in human societies in accordance with their natural gifts and the skills they have acquired. So what Pope John is saying is that all human beings, by virtue of their nature, have this right to education? Because we human beings have been blessed by God with the capacity to reason, the desire and drive to know, we therefore have a right to education. We have a right to nourish those abilities, God-given abilities. That's what he means when he's talking about this being a right in accordance with natural law. Okay? At Vatican II, the Pastoral Constitution on the Modern World, Gaudium et Spes, talks about the right to education as well. And so it repeats John's call to universalize access to higher education. It's seen as the vehicle by which the most naturally capable of every social group can fully develop and perpetuate their group's culture. Vatican II also has a document on education, the Declaration on Christian Education, and that document simply states all people have the right to education. It also says that Catholic schools have an obligation to fulfill, quote, fulfill their function in an increasingly more adequate way, and especially in caring for the needs of those who are poor in the goods of this world. That, end quote, that ought to ring dramatically countercultural to those of us who work at institutions of higher learning in the United States. And I'm going to pause for a minute and just mention this, and I'm sure for most of you this is obvious, that we live in a place where higher education has become a commodity, where it has become basically another corporation. So there's been a lot of talk and writing about the corporatization of higher education in the United States. Here, on the other hand, we hear in Catholic social teaching that, that higher education has a certain calling, and part of that calling is to open its doors to those who are economically disadvantaged so that they may take their rightful place in society and that they may contribute to and benefit from the common good. And again, I think that's in some ways profoundly countercultural for our current context. So I'm going to move forward a little bit and talk about Pope John Paul II, who himself was a university professor. And he listed the lack of access to higher education among the many scourges that face the poor and the marginalized. He lamented that this occurs in, quote, the second world, third world, and the fourth world. He refers to the fourth world, which is, in his view, the large tracts of poor in economically developed countries, such as the United States of America. So he's using the category of fourth world to talk about the poor amongst us in the United States. Elsewhere, Pope John Paul called education a primary human right, which the church and civil society must promote. He also posited education as a necessary condition of the right to human fulfillment. John Paul was clearly dismayed that more progress had not been made in realizing the right to education for all. He maintained that in many parts of the world, education opportunities for the poor are disappearing, not growing. In his view, lack of access to primary education is a particularly egregious violation of human dignity. Affluent countries often set up, in his opinion, an apartheid-like system that provides top-notch higher and secondary education to some, while devoting preciously little assets to basic education for all. That sounds like an invitation for us to think about education in the United States. Drawing on Thomistic natural law, John Paul argued that education is a fundamental human right because it is necessary for the human person to become fully human. Now, the next reference to John Paul is one of my favorite, because this is a document that those of us who work in Catholic higher education are very well familiar with. But I'm pointing to a passage that often goes overlooked. When John Paul issues this document, Ex Corde Ecclesiae, from the heart of the church, many people fail to remember that in this document he talks about how Catholic universities are obligated to do all that they can to open their doors to the economically disadvantaged. And so I won't read the entire quote, but he says, that universities must search for ways to make a university education accessible to all those who are able to benefit from it, especially the poor or members of minority groups who have customarily been marginalized and deprived of it. Okay? That's a quote that I like to remind university administrators of often. They don't necessarily take too kindly to my recalling of it. So, to summarize, Catholic social teaching doesn't posit that the poor have a right to higher education, clearly in the way that those other documents do, that I called upon earlier, but it does move towards obliging Catholic universities to everything in their power to open their doors to the economically disadvantaged. According to Pope John Paul II, it is the gospel that calls them to this task. And so, I think that what we have here in Catholic social teaching is in some ways a lacuna that needs to be filled. We need to talk about what exactly the right to higher education, the right to education means in Catholic social teaching. But I think if you locate that concept within the broader framework of Catholic social teaching, particularly solidarity and the option for the poor, what we will find, what it actually yields, is that Catholic social teaching calls for the right to higher education in a context like the United States, which is a highly developed, knowledge-based society. Okay? And so that's the argument that I want to make. Now, why do the principles of solidarity and the option for the poor yield the conclusion that the right to education must include higher education in the contemporary American context? So now I'm going to talk briefly about the meaning of solidarity and the option for the poor in Catholic social teaching, and then apply it to the issue that we're looking at. The teaching of the magisterium, the church's authoritative teaching body, unequivocally requires solidarity with the poor. The church itself must embody solidarity with the poor as a sign of its fidelity to Christ, according to Pope John Paul II in his encyclical Laborem Exercens. Solidarity with the poor and promoting social justice is not an option. It's not something that would be nice to do for Roman Catholics and Roman Catholic institutions. Rather, it is a, quote, constitutive dimension of preaching the gospel, end quote, in the words of the 1971 World Synod of Bishops document Justice in the World, Justitia in Mundo. What then does solidarity with the poor and the oppressed require in the contemporary American context? For certain, it requires the promotion of many forms of justice and many human rights. I argue, among other things, solidarity with the poor demands making higher education accessible so that they can escape marginalization and the cycle of poverty in contemporary American society. According to John Paul, the option for the poor must be translated into concrete social and economic policies in order to rectify the, quote, scandalous situation of the poor, end quote, in myriad parts of the world, including so-called developed countries, he states, like the United States. Local groups, it's up to local groups, such as universities, to decide how to apply the option to the poor to a given context, and what policies need to be developed and adopted in order to realize the option for the poor. John Paul says in one of my favorite homilies that I've read by him, he gave this homily in Poland, actually when I was living in Poland, and he talks about the passage of Zacchaeus, when Jesus says, Zacchaeus, come down from that tree in Luke chapter 19. And John Paul, in reflecting on that passage, says, Jesus says to Zacchaeus, come down today. Not tomorrow, not next week, not next year, but today. And then the Pope went on to say, the rights of the poor cannot be put on hold. He insisted that Jesus called Zacchaeus to follow him that very day, not tomorrow. Likewise, we must answer the shout and cry of the poor today. And I submit to you this evening that we on our campuses should think about this vis-a-vis expensive building projects that are proposed and undertaken, and all sorts of other expenditures. It's a question of institutional priorities. But I think at a Jesuit Catholic institution, we need to think about it in the ways that John Paul suggests.
Catholic colleges and universities can and should live out the preferential option for the poor in numerous ways. Social outreach programs and service learning courses foster solidarity with the marginalized. Yet, as the 1986 document, The General Characteristics of Jesuit Education, claimed, the option for the poor must be realized, quote, both in the students that are admitted and the type of formation that is given, end quote. So outreach programs, service learning, they're important forms of building solidarity with the poor, not enough. We have to think about this in all of our institutional policies, including admissions policies, financial aid policies, etc. Solidarity must be embodied in policies and institutions that promote the participation of the oppressed as agents of personal and social change. Because of the nature of the American economy and contemporary society, in order for the poor to have this kind of participation in society, they must be able to attain, among other things, a college education. Without the proper training, skills, and knowledge, people tend to be relegated to the sidelines of the market and of the polis more broadly. As the economist Amartya Sen puts it, educational deficiencies seriously detract from the ability to attain freedoms that all persons wish to enjoy, such as political participation, economic activity, literacy, numeracy, and health. So Sen draws linkages between the attainment of education and the attainment of other human freedoms, which all human beings value and should rightly have. Historically, as many of you know, higher education, if you ask your grandparents and parents, many of you will be told that higher education increasingly functioned in this country as the engine of social mobility. This was particularly true after World War II. However, access to higher education and social mobility in the United States has begun to disappear in recent decades, with social stratification becoming more pronounced and entrenched. Educational level is the single biggest predictor of the ability to escape inherited poverty. The premium rewarded to wage earners for college education has substantially risen since the 1970s. In 1999, the average salary of those who completed four-year colleges was close to $50,000. Those with advanced degrees earned approximately $70,000. At the other end of the scale, high school graduates earned $27,000. While those who did not graduate from high school earned less than $20,000. And those gaps have continued to increase as I've looked at those numbers over the years. The gap between, in earnings, the earnings gap between college graduates and high school graduates and non-high school graduates. Children from the highest income quartile are 5 times more likely to complete undergraduate education, thereby gaining much greater earning potential than those in the lowest quartile. Those who do not complete college are almost destined to low-wage jobs. Therefore, they are in much greater jeopardy of joining the ranks of America's working poor than those who attain a bachelor's degree. Thus, the cycle of poverty is complete. If you come from a poor family, you are much less likely to obtain a college degree. This means you are much more likely to endure poverty than your counterparts from affluent backgrounds. This has always been the case. However, the correlation between A, economic background and educational attainment, and B, the risk of poverty and educational deprivation has become increasingly significant. In addition, because of the strong link between economic status and educational achievement, the economic disadvantages that arise due to a lack of college education vitiate true political liberty for all in the United States. As the philosopher John Rawls argued in A Theory of Justice, in a democracy that allows for vast inequalities of wealth and property, all people do not have the same, quote, fair value of political liberty, end quote. This is true because the wealthy have a greater likelihood of influencing politicians and political parties whose campaigns are privately financed. They also have more opportunity to advance their interests by controlling the media and influencing those who may pass laws that further their interests. In other words, not having a college degree seriously detracts from the ability of the poor to advocate their economic, social, and cultural needs in government and public policy making. In these circumstances, I argue, solidarity, which seeks to empower the poor in order to escape marginalization, requires the fulfillment of the right to higher education. The poor have a right to participate fully in all cultural, political, economic, and social spheres of society. Given the relationship between educational attainment, economic status, access to these other spheres in American society, the poor must be able to take their place at American universities. So I'm going to turn now to, finally, Catholic universities in the United States. And again, this is not an exhaustive treatment, but it's just a sampling to illustrate the points that I'm trying to make. The majority of the unfortunately, the majority of students at many, if not most, Catholic colleges and universities today come from affluent backgrounds, while most of the nation's and the world's poor remain excluded from their halls. There are, of course, exceptions to the rule at every institution. I myself was blessed to go to a Jesuit college on a full scholarship. My parents' EFC, I was telling folks over dinner, estimated family contribution was 0. That's the kind of family that I came from. But I was blessed with a full scholarship. And unfortunately, those opportunities seem to be few and far between, even though there are sincere efforts on many Jesuit and Catholic college campuses to change it. So I'll just walk you through some of the data. This is 2007, 2008. You can see my own home institution, only 7% of the student body at the time, Pell eligible. Villanova, just up the road, 8%. Georgetown, my alma mater, 8%. Fairfield, you get the point, right? You saw the graphs from earlier in the presentation. I particularly, just to summarize for the sake of time, find fault with the universities like Notre Dame, Boston College, and Georgetown, which have much larger endowments, right? If you have much larger endowments, they ought to be able to do more to realize the option for the poor and the right to education in the way I've been describing. University of Notre Dame, as some of you know, has an endowment which is more than $6 billion. Okay, and yet they're not doing well in this regard. And some progress has been made. You can see that some of these universities have increased the numbers of financially disadvantaged students. But again, to put it simply, this is not something to be satisfied with, not something to call us to rest on our laurels. Obviously, much more needs to be done. Another important way to look at this is to go beyond, and a way we should look at this is to go beyond the Pell Grade indicator and look at different brackets of income levels to look at the real situation with regard to economic diversity. So what you find here is you can see that at many of these schools, the vast amount of students, we take Georgetown, for example, the dark blue, almost 60%, that's about 57% of the student body doesn't apply for financial aid at all. Whereas of those students who get financial aid, this is the proportion of students who come from families that earn less than $30,000. So you can see the difference. And that's basically, that trend carries across most of the universities that I've looked at. By the way, the data that I use in this report, it's publicly reported data. The Institute for College Access and Success database is a wonderful resource for this. You can look at it there. So, and again, looking at economic diversity, I'll just summarize for the sake of time by saying when you see dark blue, you know you have up this high, and yellow and green down here, you know that something's awry, and it needs to be looked at more closely. There are some schools, Catholic schools, that are doing better than the first group that I mentioned. So Holy Cross with 12%, Marquette, Gonzaga, Scranton 16%, Seton Hall 19%. That's 2007, 2008. Scranton, I'm happy to tell you, is up to 20%. In terms of the recent data, the most recent data that I was able to obtain. Again, the question to ask is, could we be doing more? When you have a college like Berea, which is at 78%, Scranton is at 20%, my home institution of St. Joseph's at 12%. Okay. So I'm going to just skip ahead. You can see that there are, to point out, which I think is important, universities, Catholic universities, that are doing a very good job in this regard. Xavier, University of Louisiana, 59%. Trinity in Washington, D.C., 64%. St. Peter's in New Jersey, which is a Jesuit school, as some of you know, 45%, et cetera, et cetera. LaSalle, another Philadelphia school, 32%. And so I think it's very important to ask ourselves the question, well, why are these schools doing so well as opposed to the other schools that we looked at, Catholic universities and colleges that we looked at earlier? What's going on? I can't answer those questions, but I think those are the kinds of questions that need to be raised on all of our campuses. And again, looking more deeply at economic diversity, there are schools, Catholic universities and colleges that do have a much greater degree of economic diversity. You can see those yellow lines bumping up. So we've got more economic, so in other words, that means we have more students who come from families with an income of below $30,000 than the other schools that we looked at. So I want to just briefly, I know we're running short on time, and I've talked far too long, point to some conclusions and future directions, because again, I think it's important not only to point out the problems, but to at least ponder together ways forward. And I know that in today's market-driven society, Catholic institutions, if I may quote the Bible in this context, must be, quote, wise as serpents and innocent as doves. In other words, they must carefully balance the need to be financially sound and institutionally competitive with the mandates of Catholic social teaching, as I've tried to explain them tonight. My mentor from Boston College, Father David Hollenbach, questioned whether or not American Catholic universities can remain faithful to their mission identity if they operate like corporations. And I share his concern. In other words, by measuring success according to profit margins and status. That's something that we need to look at. So these are the ways that I've come to believe we can work towards opening our doors more widely to the economically disadvantaged. And I'll just walk you through them quickly. We need more aggressive recruiting. There are now organizations that have sprung up that help link students of lesser means with excellent schools. What one finds is, and there's research to show, a lot of students who are extremely talented but economically disadvantaged don't believe they can get into an excellent school like the University of Scranton, and they also don't believe that they're welcomed at a place like the University of Scranton or another excellent university. And so we at our schools need to do more, avail ourselves of some of these kinds of institutions. I argue, and I'll just mention this briefly, that I think the SAT needs to be made optional. There have been schools that have experimented with this. I'll mention just one, Holy Cross, pretty good school, right? Not a bad school. They made the SAT optional, and as their president wrote in the Boston Globe, it did not adversely affect the caliber of the student body. In fact, it actually improved the caliber of the student body. And I don't have time to go into the argument, but the schools like Holy Cross and a number of other excellent schools that have done this have not noted any decrease in the caliber of student. For what it's worth, I believe the research that argues or demonstrates that the SAT has a class and race-based bias, and that's another reason why I think it needs to be made optional. There are other ways for students to demonstrate their achievement and their potential. I think we need to do a better job of fostering an environment that is welcoming for students who are of lesser economic means. I'm going to put it very bluntly because I don't know any other way. A lot of our campuses these days look like country clubs. And if you don't have the latest Abercrombie and Finch, or now it seems to be, the iPod, I don't know, what are they, up to 12 at this point? I honestly don't know, or the iPad 7, you're an outcast. And so I think at a Catholic university has to challenge the culture of materialism that exists in our society. And in doing so, we might be able to create a more welcoming environment for students who can't afford those things that many of our affluent students can afford. I think we need to engage in creative fundraising. that focuses on or taps into, utilizes some of the language that I've presented tonight. Catholic mission and identity, Jesuit mission and identity, and seek more donors. Schools are doing this. I imagine Scranton is doing this. St. Joseph's is doing it to a degree. Georgetown has an open doors program. Boston College as well. We need to continue to do this. And ask donors, for example, when they suggest that they'd like to donate X amount of dollars for a new athletic facility, we might ask them, well, what do you think about giving to this particular cause in order to make our universities thrive as Jesuit Catholic institutions? Okay. I think that faculty and religious on campuses where there are religious need to be involved in admissions, and students as well. And in those admissions conversations, we need to advocate for economically disadvantaged students. Give them a second look. Just because the SAT score, if we're using the SAT, isn't where we think it should be, is this student qualified in other ways? And in fact, I'm not going to talk about it here, but a number of people, such as William Bowen, the former president of Princeton University, have argued that there should be admissions preferences in the formula used in the admissions process for economically disadvantaged students. We have them for athletes. I know I was one of them. I was a recruited athlete. I know I got points or whatever you want to call it, some kind of preference. 35%, roughly 35% from the data I've seen of students at any given university got into that university because of some hook, whether it's legacy status, they're a recruited athlete, they are quote-unquote development cases. In other words, their parents have a lot of money and the development office would like to tap into that. Why not have preferences of this sort for economically disadvantaged students? We also need to partner with local schools and communities and parents. We talked a little bit about this over dinner. Catholic institutions can begin to help educate economically disadvantaged students from the earliest beginnings. I've watched my own 8-year-old daughter grow, and I can tell you, I think there's research to validate what I'm about to say from my own experience. Those early years are crucial. The earliest years of education, starting in preschool, are crucial. And I watch my daughter grow, and there are so many students, young people, who don't even have access to preschools. So what can we do as Catholic universities to remedy that and help to educate students from economically disadvantaged backgrounds from the earliest years so that they will be college ready or prepared for college? And finally, I mentioned Drexel because it's a university in Philadelphia that decided a couple of years ago that they were going to dedicate a massive amount of money to the goal of increasing economic diversity. In other words, opening their doors to economically disadvantaged students. Drexel at that point, it was 2 years or 3 years ago, I guess at this point, endowed 250 new full scholarships for our students from economically disadvantaged, not 5, 10, 250. So that's really, beginning to walk the walk. And when I noted that, I thought that's inspiring, that's wonderful. The president of Drexel University stated that he didn't want students, young people from West Philadelphia, to walk by his campus and think, I can't go there. I'm not welcome there. I can't afford that. And when I read that, I thought to myself, why aren't we doing that at this Jesuit Catholic university where I work? And I think I'll close with that. So I thank you for your patience and attention, and I hope if you have some time and energy to answer some questions. Yes?
Brilliant stuff. Obviously, I agree. And I know some of the problems. I mean, I sat in the cabinet at St. Joe's, and they named how many African-American students earned more than 1,200 on the SATs in Pennsylvania that year. It was a minuscule number. And they're all getting full rides to Harvard and Haverford. And then the problem with St. Joe's being such a small minority population, you got the choice of going to St. Joe's with a 900, 800 SAT, struggling, or you can go down to Temple where 26% of the place looks like you. So there's these competitive issues also. My other thing is, I'm all for Catholic schools trying to do this, but we're the small players in this game. Harvard's freaking endowment is $32 billion. We're like, what, 140 million? The other argument is that some of the big names in this higher education system have to have something given to the other institutions. Because the schools in the Bereas where everybody, works for, everybody goes there for free because they all do, they clean the toilets and they cook the food. That's a great system too. But these middle schools, we're not rich enough to do what the rich schools do. Drexel, in a sense, is much stronger than we are. So we can do little things, we can do little symbolic things, but until we become bigger, animals in the jungle, we're a little handicapped in doing what some of the things we'd like to do.
Well, I hear what you're saying, but well, let's start with
Help the poor. Harvard, $32 billion.
Right.
Notre Dame, $4.6 billion.
Yeah, no, Notre Dame, I don't have a whole lot of sympathy for Notre Dame because they do have a $6 billion, that's no small amount, right?
Harvard, my other thing is, if we went into the freaking defense budget, $3 trillion in the last 10 years, we could have given free higher education to everybody in the country for the next 50 years.
Well, I think you would probably agree that everything I said is pretty countercultural at this point. I mentioned at the outset that there's backlash against subsidizing economically disadvantaged students by paying, full tuition. In other words, parents are beginning to say, well, why do I have to pay full tuition for my kid when Johnny or Jane over here goes, at a small fraction of the cost? And they're not interested in the option for the poor or what have you, because that's not what we quote unquote feed our children when they grow up in the United States. I watched this with my own daughter. We're taught from a very early age to look out for me, myself, and I. And so, but you know very well that part of the sacramental principle of Catholicism and the incarnational principle is to be countercultural and to show that we in fact are created to be with and for others. It's who we are. And so we have a different anthropology. And we have to trumpet that at Catholic institutions loudly and clearly, and I don't think a lot of us are. So there's that sort of theological problem. I do agree that, and that's, I kind of glossed over, but I am trying to say I want to hold, of the Catholic schools, I want to hold those like Notre Dame with the bigger endowments more accountable because they should well do more. But then again, if you look back, where did that go? I'm sorry, but Christian Brothers probably doesn't have as much as Scranton does in its bank account. St. Peter's certainly doesn't have as much as St. Joe's does, right? And so it's not only the schools that have the massive endowments that are doing well at this. It's a matter of institutional priorities. And those schools have made the choice to devote more resources to this than a place like St. Joe's. I think this proves that LaSalle. I had great conversations with the people at LaSalle who work on this issue. And they say it's part of their ethos and their mission. It comes right out of their founders, of course, ideals about education. And they've decided that they're going to try all they can to stick with that mission. So like my mentor David Hollenbach says, are we going to just sell out? Forget it. We have almost total amnesia about our roots as Catholic institutions. If you have a bigger endowment, yes, you can do more, but some schools are doing pretty well without, it seems. As Milton Friedman said, there's no such thing as a free lunch. You have to, something's got to give, right? So what I advocate is everybody should be willing to make sacrifices. That includes faculty. Now, I gave this talk once at Villanova University, and one student said, well, maybe you should forego your salary. And maybe you should work for free. And I said, well, Christianity has long recognized, maybe this is a cop-out, special obligations to one's familial members. Thomas Aquinas called it the ordo caritas, the order of love. And so my obligation to my daughter and to feed her and to put her through school and have health care for my daughter, that's a real obligation that I can't forego. But I should be able to make some sacrifices. I should want to be able to make some sacrifices. So maybe I don't get to go to, if we're going to make this real, maybe I don't get to go to 2 conferences a year. Maybe I go to 1. Maybe I go to none. Maybe that becomes a policy at the university. Maybe I do give up part of my retirement benefits. But I can tell you this, and I told this to a high-ranking administrator at my university, if I'm going to give up part of my retirement benefit, then I want to know that it's going to something like this, not to go buy another property, not to build another fancy building or luxury suites for students to live in. So I think it does call for a shared sacrifice, but that sacrifice needs to be equitable and it needs to be for the right reasons. Yes?
I'm in the education department here, and often when we, and when I say we, I mean sort of discussions in the field of education about creating more diverse learning environments and schools, often the discussion sort of falls along two lines. And I think of it in terms of integration versus inclusion, where integration has to do with trying to integrate diverse populations into an already existing structure, whether it's a school system, our understanding of what 7th grade is or something like that, versus inclusion, which has to do with transforming those very structures, the school, the university, perhaps. And I noticed that you kind of see it in both senses, that we have a responsibility to integrate, but also to change the culture of the institutions that we're trying to integrate diverse student populations.
Yeah, and thank you for those terms, because I think that they do get at what I'm arguing, and that is we do need to change the culture at our universities. And when we open our doors to economically disadvantaged students, we want them to come and be full partners, not sort of second-class citizens. And that allowing them to be full partners, inviting them to be full partners, means that, yeah, we do need to change. And I don't presume to know all the answers as to how. That would involve conversation with all members of the community about how we do need to change. But I do stand by what I said earlier, and that is, I think we need to be aware of a sort of elitism on many of our campuses. I've read some articles about a leading phenomenon at Jesuit high schools as well. So that's, as a graduate of one of them, I'm concerned about that. So I think you're right. I think it has to be, that inclusion piece is crucial.
Would you say that in the greater success stories that you've identified here, that what was leading the way was this effort at a kind of cultural transformation at the level of the institution, or was it something like a really sound business model that made it happen? I mean, what's the driving narrative where success is happening?
Well, I suppose that there needs to be a successful business model in order to make this fly. But from what I've gathered, and I talk with people at universities that are doing well, some of the schools that I point to here, I do really think there's an institutional commitment, a certain so LaSalle, for example, an institutional ethos. Seton Hall as well, which is doing pretty well. Now, by the way, I also, to be fair, I think some of it has to do with geography. So if you're a school, in the inner city or close to an inner city, and you sort of have more access to students of lesser economic means, but the translation is not always there. I mean, St. Joe's we're right on right at the on the border between West Philadelphia and the main line, the suburbs of Philadelphia, and yet our doors are closed to so many of the students who I'm sure would love to get a St. Joseph's education, but they can't afford it. So, yeah.
One thing, I don't take anything away from St. Peter's, but I think it's your corporate model. St. Joe's raised its tuition exponentially in the 90s to keep up with Villanova.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the weird things about college education is people will go to a school that costs more. And if a school costs less, it's a lesser education. So schools literally raise their tuitions up to the, it's sort of bottom or topping out at 50,000. But the St. Peter's, the Chestnut Hills lost out on that. And so they began to attract the students who could pay or would be attracted to a lower price tag.
Yeah, I've heard that as well. I've heard that from administrators. It's a little befuddling to me. If I'm a parent and I'm a student, would I choose a good quality education at a lesser price than a good quality education at a higher price? I mean, to me, it's a no-brainer.
Pre-2008, man, it was crazy. The Chevis-Regal effect, they call it.
Right.
People were raising their prices, and people were paying. The worst thing I heard about St. Joe's my time there was that now all the kids who used to go to Villanova also go to St. Joe's.
Mm-hmm.
St. Joe's was the working class college, and Villanova
Right.
was the main line. And now the two are virtually the same.
You mentioned 2008. I do think it's changing. I mean, if some of you know, the Obama administration has called for much greater transparency. Now, as a college professor, I'm not necessarily one to enjoy being monitored and assessed by the federal government, although I think there's a place for it. And I do laud the efforts of the Obama administration to do this. I believe the website is called College Navigator, where you can very closely examine the costs, a lot of the stuff that I talked about, and then some, as far as how financial aid is, what's the average net cost, what's the average net cost of students in this income bracket versus this income bracket, and all of that is an attempt by the administration to call colleges to the carpet and say, you're being profligate in a lot of ways. You're charging, exorbitant amounts of money, and we need to talk about why you're charging. And you just pointed out something which is completely irrational, to my mind. Now, maybe I'm the irrational one, but to my mind, that's irrational. And so it's a good thing that the Obama administration is beginning to talk about this, and I think parents are probably starting to question that, right?
And the other thing was the other thing to add to your argument, the inequality of the loans. So many kids now have gone to these schools, taking out loans to pay this stuff off, and are having a very hard time now.
Right.
And it's a terrible drain on their whole generation.
Yeah. I'd be curious to know what some of the students in the room think about any of this. Yes, sir.
I think there's some other steps that the church could actually take other than just monetary. Like they could maybe sponsor some sort of free online courses to lower income families, and maybe have those be worth college credits or something. If you score well on them or something like that. I'm just saying they can think more so out of the box instead of just thinking of everything as just financially and just giving money to poor people so they can go to school. There has to be other form of solutions in that.
I think I like what you said. I think you're right that Catholic institutions need to think outside the box. As I understand it, and anybody is free to correct me if I'm wrong, but at present, an online degree, it's not accredited, and so it's really not worth what a traditional college degree is. Although I understand there's a movement afoot to do that, to get accreditation, which might put people like us out of business. But yeah, I do agree that all avenues should be explored. By the same token, I wouldn't want to see a situation where people on our campuses, administrators and others on our campuses are saying, well, yeah, Catholic institutions and the church have now created these options over here, so there's no need for us we could just keep going about business as usual here. You see what I mean? So I like what you're saying. So I think it's just a both and, so that we don't get into that situation that I fear. Any other thoughts?
I was going to say that I agree with you on the concept of maybe colleges going out to more schools, not only locally, because I know this school I go here now, but when I applied, it was just something that I stumbled upon. It wasn't anything that I thought of. And my friend who actually went to Catholic school knew all about this school, but I didn't. I knew about the other public colleges and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you're right when you say that some kids may think that they can't go here just because it is expensive. So maybe if schools do go out and say hey, we can offer you this, then maybe a lot more people can, try and apply to these schools. So maybe diversity can rise a little bit.
Yeah, one of my colleagues, one of your former colleagues, Dr. Melissa Loke, showed me some of the data about public school students at some of the best public schools in Philadelphia, and you know, there's a large talent pool there that's not being tapped into. So I think I'm just agreeing with you and echoing you that we need to engage in a more robust effort to do this. And I lament that I hear very often, and I say this again as a person who came from a working class background where my family had an EFC of 0. My mom didn't go to college. My dad was a welder. And so what one often hears about people like me is, well, there's no way they can cut it. They can't hack it in college. You know, they're underprepared if they didn't, you know, it's just not possible. Well, I think it is possible. There are, as you're saying, talented people who are hungry to get a degree, and we need to find them and work with them to help them make it happen. And then, you know, this is going to sound harsh, but I'm going to say it. Underpreparedness does not discriminate in terms of economic background. I mean, I've met students who have gone to the best prep schools in the country and come from very affluent backgrounds, and some of them are underprepared. I mean, so it's not only about where you come from economically. You know, you can find people in underprivileged backgrounds who have parents who have been, you know, very dedicated to their education from the earliest beginnings, and they deserve a chance too.
I think there also needs to be like a fundamental shift in this country among the rich and the affluent, the people that you're mentioning, to realize that this is a problem and that they have a role in the process. You know, they have the means of doing this, and it's something that's echoed in the tax debate too. I mean, should the rich pay more in order to provide for the poor? To me, it's the exact same debate. So the shift doesn't have to, it can't just be with the university. It has to be a shift in the minds of those affluent people that you're mentioning.
So I can,
which isn't easy.
No, I can say I wholeheartedly agree with you. If you figure out how we can do this, let me know and I'll work with you on it. I mean, as I teach ethics at St. Joseph's University, and you know, so I'd like to think what we do as educators can help. Churches should be addressing this issue, but you yourself point out, I mean, it's a lot of people don't want to talk about this. It's taboo, and it's not an issue that, even though, for example, if you think about churches, Christian churches, I think many theologians like myself are prepared to argue churches have an obligation to talk about this to all of their congregants, but they shy away from it for various reasons. So I guess the only thing I can really say is, and I've thought a lot about this because I write a lot about solidarity and how it should be embodied in various forms. If we're going to do this, we have to start when kids are really, really young. Because like I was saying, I hate to say it, I'm not trying to throw my own daughter under the bus, so don't get me wrong, but I watch the sense of acquisitiveness develop in her as she's exposed to more and more people outside the home. And it started at a very early age. So we have to, you know, educate our children in a way that, you know, we educate them to become citizens of the world, to want to be in solidarity with others. I think, I know this is controversial, but public schooling and the you know, sort of visceral reaction against any talk of ethics in public schools, I think that's doing us a disservice. I think, you know, we need to have some kind of ethics courses, ethics education curriculum in public schools as well. How we go about that, that's, I don't know, but I think it needs to happen.
And just add to Louise what you're saying, Sister Helen and Camden said it's all over by the time they're 3.
Yeah.
So I implore young people like yourselves, think of a year or two of volunteer work you have to get out of here. The Catholic school system, when I was in the middle of the baby boom in 55 and 65, I had one nun in first grade in 61. 65 kids and one nun. But she got it done. She was young, she was energetic. We need young people to reach back and help the disadvantaged, really small people. I wish we could figure out how to get some of these rich Catholics into rebuilding our Catholic school system, because that's the great failure of my generation.
Mm-hmm.
That this thing is just, you know, but it was basically the labor of the nuns.
Yeah.
And we have no more nuns.
You know, you mentioned,
They're not treated well, so they've walked, or young women haven't joined. But to try to recreate that is a tremendous challenge for a generation.
and I have to say, in Philadelphia, and I'm sure you're aware of it, there's been an effort that some wealthy business people have tried to salvage the Catholic schools. And, well, let's just say there's resistance on the part of the archdiocese. And so here we go with the church's hierarchy failing to do what it needs to do. I mean, you have people who are willing to step up, lay people, and for goodness sakes, how long ago was Vatican II? The distrust between the clergy and the laity that still exists in some quarters, that gets in the way of these kinds of efforts of the laity taking the reins of the Catholic schools and moving forward with creative business models. I mean, that has to be addressed.
We can't use Philadelphia as an example or a model, right? Is everything that bad?
No, well, it's just, it's where I live and breathe, and I see, Philadelphia, went to Catholic schools there, and Philadelphia had a very robust Catholic school system, which did a lot of good for economically marginalized kids. But the schools are closing. Now this is nationwide. I mean, I think you know the pattern. The schools close in the inner cities, and new schools are being built in the affluent suburbs. Grammar schools, Catholic grammar schools. Where's that commitment to the option for the poor? And I know that it's hard, but again, if there are creative partnerships between business people and the hierarchy that can make it happen, then why not let's run with them?
Thank you very much.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you very much for coming, and I wish you all good luck and enjoy your spring break in a couple weeks.